Okay. I feel perfect today. Right.
You're welcome. I'll bring the quiz too.
All right, before that gives us all a headache. And we'll go. All right, so this is about as confusing as I can get it. So for those of you joining on chat, or joining us on Zoom, in the chat, I just put a link to the same quiz, so we'll have a few slides before we get there. So thank you for joining us. This is the first class called At the Crossroads, which is going to look at the 4 different gospel passion narratives. This is the first time I've ever done a disclaimer before a class, but the one warning I will give you is the more time you spend studying Scripture, the more interesting Scripture gets. So be prepared to go down a rabbit hole for the rest of your life looking at Scripture. So if you enjoy this class, just a warning, you might enjoy more classes after this. So just wanted to give you full heads up of what's coming. So if you could take a few minutes to take the quiz, if you haven't done so already. The goal is not to discourage you. That's kind of the first thing I want to say. The goal is, I think, more than anything, to maybe be surprised by the answers. So what were you expecting? Was there something different in the answers? Did you think that every event happened in all 4 Gospels? Is it weird that sometimes the answer is only one? Or, but don't worry about getting it right. Think about if anything surprises you. So if you want to take it online, you can also use the QR code, or if you're online and if you couldn't use the link in the chat and you just wanted to use your phone to scan that QR code, we've got like 6 different ways to take this quiz. So, and while you guys are taking the quiz, if you guys have any questions before we begin, anything to start, I can also answer questions as well. Evening, Roy.
Hi there.
Checking in on my Zoom folks. All right.
Mike, should we post the quiz?
The quiz is in the chat.
Doesn't always stay there. For some reason.
Okay.
Are you going to lecture on some of these subjects?
Yes. Yeah, that's the hope. I need a pen so I can take the quiz too, or at least make a key off the top of my head. Okay. Oops, I need to start that. So for my friends online, let me, I'll post the thing one more time, but how are we doing on time? give a few more minutes? I don't want to rush you, but the answers aren't critical. Yeah. You just randomly guess, A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D. So. Okay, so don't worry if you haven't finished. We'll just kind of go over these relatively quickly. I will give you a quick hint before we do this. There's no curveballs. There are no nuns. So all of those 23 events at least happen in one gospel. So we would never have a nun here. Shucks. Okay. We'll kind of start with a surprising difference. What gospel or gospels does Jesus have a Passover meal with his disciples? Any guesses?
Also,
All right, I'm just going to go through them then. All right, nobody wants to be brave. So it's going to be Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Jesus has a Passover meal with his disciples, which then leaves us to John, has a special meal with his disciples the day before Passover. That'll be back to that in week. What do people mark for Judas leaves dinner early to betray Jesus? Luke and John for sure. And?
Luke and John?
And Matthew and Mark. Yeah. Yeah, so some of these, the point is to see both convergence and divergence. So Jesus goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, all four Gospels. Jesus prays to have the cup pass over him is Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The shorthand for that is going to be called the Synoptic Gospels. We can go over what that means in a second. Peter strikes the ear of a slave belonging to the high priest. This is John. John alone. In what gospel does Peter deny Jesus 3 times? All 4. Yep.
Have a none when there is none, but no all. When there are several alls.
I didn't want to make it, I thought it'd be easier to check all 4 than all. So, yeah. But good feedback, Russ. I appreciate it. Yeah, all right. So Pilate sends Jesus before Herod, the governor of Galilee, happens in Luke and Luke alone. Pilate offers the crowd a choice, is all 4. This is an interesting one. This happens very rarely. Jesus is led to Golgotha for his crucifixion. Does anyone want to venture a guess? It's rare because it's Mark, Matthew, and John. Luke calls it Calvary, which is Golgotha translated into Latin, translated into Greek. So Luke is the one there. In the Synoptics, so Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we compel Simon of Cyrene to carry Jesus' cross. The other way of saying that is in John, only Jesus carries the cross. Jesus. So 12, 12, it's Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
I guess, okay, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, not.
Yep, not John. 13 is Luke only. 14 is all four Gospels. 15 is the Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. 16 is John only. So 16, John is the only gospel to have a disciple at the cross. Jesus dies in darkness is the Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The temple is ripped in two at the moment of Jesus' death is Matthew and Mark. An earthquake occurs at the time of Jesus' death. 19 is Matthew only. Same with 20. 21 is John only. Roman soldiers pierced Jesus' side to confirm his death. 22, this is a slight curveball. Joseph of Arimathea takes the body and buries him in a nearby tomb. That is all four Gospels. But if we wanted to be really nitpicky, in the Gospel of John, Joseph of Arimathea is joined by, John chapter 3, Nicodemus. I knew I could pull it out there somewhere. It's Matthew only that the Pharisees request the tomb be sealed and guarded. What does Jesus say before his death? There's 7 words. So I'm going to pull up the quiz here real quick. So my God, why have you forsaken me? Is Matthew and Mark. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. Truly, I tell you this day you will be with me in paradise. And Father, into your hands I commend my spirit is Luke. Woman, behold thy son, and behold thy mother. I'm thirsty, and it is finished is the Gospel of John. Surely this man was innocent is what the centurion says in Mark and Matthew. And truly this was the Son of God is in Luke. We don't have a centurion's report in John's Gospel. Number 2, what does the centurion say at the foot of the cross? Special meal with his disciples the day before Passover. That's John. Yeah. So when we talk about our agenda and the hopes for tonight, what I hope we see in the quiz is places of convergence and divergence. There's places where the Gospels all seem to agree the same thing happened. And there's places where Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John say something slightly different happened. Sometimes they agree with each other, sometimes they don't. And so what we're going to be looking at during the next 5 weeks is why, when there are differences, what can we attribute these differences to? And so the inspiration of this class, because it's a class all on the Passion narratives, it's not surprising that the inspiration for this class is our Good Friday service. For years, our Good Friday service has felt very, I don't want to say confrontational, full of tension. We typically read the same lessons every single Good Friday. It doesn't matter what year it is. Parentheses, I'm changing it. But what the Book of Common Prayer says is that one of the readings we always read on Good Friday is Psalm 22. The other is the Gospel of John. That's typically the only gospel we hear on Good Friday. But these give us 2 very stark differences on how to interpret Good Friday. So Psalm 22 starts out with, my God, why have you forsaken me? And in these 3 verses, we hear kind of plaintive cries of the psalmist. I am poured out like water, all my bones are out of joint, my heart within my breast is melting wax, my mouth is dried out, my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You have laid me in the dust of a grave, Packs of dogs close me in. Gangs of evildoers circle around me. They pierce my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them. They cast lots for my clothing. Right? This is, in a word or two, not good. Right? This is absolute pain, suffering, fear. But when we read from the Gospel of John, we get a completely different picture. After this, when Jesus knew that all was now finished, he said, in order to fulfill Scripture, I am thirsty. And a jar full of sour wine was standing there, so they put a sponge full of wine on the branch of hyssop, and they held it to his mouth. And when Jesus received the wine, he said, it is finished. And then he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. So in the psalm, we hear really painful cries of someone who feels abandoned by God. And in Matthew and Mark, the first verse literally becomes the words of Jesus, my God, why have you forsaken me? When Matthew and Mark talk about the scripture being fulfilled, of they cast lots to divide my clothing, it's Psalm 22 they're pointing to. But in John, at his crucifixion, Jesus seems to be in total control. He's calm. He seems to even have the bodily control over the time and manner of his own death. He chooses essentially when to die, right? So which is it? Is it the kind of suffering Jesus, or is the cross a place of glory? Right? And so here on my right is the Raphael image of the crucifixion, right? Like, Jesus doesn't look in anguish, right? We kind of see what we can presume to be Mary and the beloved disciple beneath him. He seems to be inviting them to become a family, right? Woman, behold your son. Son, behold your mother. He just seems comfortable there. Where on the other, we have a kind of grotesque, Jesus' shoulders look dislocated, his elbows look dislocated, his feet just look, and ankles just look absolutely out of joint, right? And so if art can understand the crucifixion in very different ways, I think it gives us permission to read the Gospels through that same understanding. That Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John attach very different meanings to what is going on at Good Friday, in the garden, at the trial, and ultimately on the cross. I'll go over some assumptions, and then I'll turn the table over for Ryan so I can take a break. So this class has several assumptions that I think you should be aware of before we begin. The first assumption is that the Passion narratives, and we're going to shorten this to PN, they are different. That's the first assumption. We're not going to try to just ignore the parts where Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John differ from each other. Like the broader gospel, the Passion narratives are works of both history, biography, drama, and theology. It's important to note that in the Episcopal Church, it makes allowances for how the community can participate in the Good Friday story by assigning it as a dramatic play, right? So we can invite someone to be the voice of Pilate, to be the chief priests, to be the crowd kind of mocking Jesus. There is drama, particularly, I go back to the Gospel of John. John loves irony. And so we have Pilate goes back and forth from kind of the dark inside of his office, where he's interviewing Jesus, to the outside where it is light, where he's kind of talking back to the crowds. Is this the one you really want me to crucify? What's ironic for John is, of course, is that the light of the world is inside the dark room and the powers of darkness are outside in the light. And so John uses this kind of dramatic tension and irony to kind of help us understand it's not quite what Pilate thinks is happening. And so if we approach it not just Scripture, we don't want to report this, we don't want to use the Gospels like the evening news. If we understand that there is history, they are grounded in history, there's a bit of biography, but there's also drama, and there's especially theology. That, I think, will kind of help us understand the classes, the whole point of why we're together. And when we put all these things together, when we put the historical context of the community that wrote this gospel, its original audience, the theology, the history, even the language, we start to get towards the meaning of the cross. And so what we're going to do is 1 week at a time, we will look at what is the meaning of the cross for Mark, which will be next week's class. Then in week 2, we're going to turn to Matthew, and then to Luke, and then to John. And that'll kind of be our 5-week class. So tonight is just kind of an introduction, maybe get you a little off balance, show you how different the passion narratives are, give you a little bit of an introduction for where we're headed, and then we'll send you on your way. Yes, Juan, you got a question?
Yeah, this may be too basic.
No, there's no such thing.
It seems that Raphael's portrait carries the day, otherwise it would be called Bad Friday.
Do you want to talk through the etymology of Good Friday?
I'm not certain I remember that off the top of my head.
Okay.
I'm being perfectly honest.
Okay, sounds good. You just got demoted on my bar trivia team for biblical trivia, right? So there's a shared etymology between good and God, right? So have a godly morrow, have a godly day turns into good day, good morning. So good isn't a adjective describing what happened as being positive or negative. It's more an ownership. It's a day that belongs to God. So, but it's that's how I would, etymologically speaking, that's how I would interpret it. So, and now that you know that, we're back on the same trivia team. Yeah, so. All right, so where we go? Oh, so Juan, thank you for the question. Any questions online so far? At any time, to my Zoom friends, just please unmute and interrupt with a question. It never is a bother. So, okay. So kind of what I said, each week we're going to look at a single passion narrative. And the whole point of this is to see, one, how rich and how varied the passion narratives are. And the second is to try to understand what did the cross mean to the original community which heard the gospel. We have the benefit of having all 4 handed down to us. But what did these mean for the Markan community, the Matthean, the Lucan, and the Johannine? So, Ren, I'm going to walk through who the evangelists are, if you can do the timeline, and then source criticism. Okay, so we talk about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. When we talk about the people who wrote them, we usually assign them the title of evangelists. We know very little about any of them. There is a strong tradition that Mark was a companion of Peter in Rome near his death and martyrdom. And similarly, we have a very good sense that Luke was a companion of Paul. And the reason we know that is the second half of the Gospel of Luke is the book of Acts. And late in chapter 26, Luke lets it slip. He uses the first person plural. When he's talking about Paul going to Thessalonica, he says, we were headed there. So we have a sense that Luke and Paul were companions. But each of the Gospels have some subtle clues as to the attributes of the author, which is something different than their identity. So I can't tell you who these people were, but I can tell you with all likelihood that Matthew was a Jewish scribe. Why do I think Matthew was a Jewish scribe? Because Jesus has this habit of denouncing groups of people in Jewish leadership. He denounces the scribes, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees. What happens when we get to Matthew's gospel? It doesn't say anything bad about the scribes. Pharisees and the Sadducees get called out for being jerks, right? And so kind of sense that like, oh, Matthew has a special place in his heart for Jewish scribes. So there's clues like that. The other clue, which I'll get to in a second, some of the miracles, some of the language, some of the geography kind of give us clues as to where these gospels may have been written. And with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Ryan, who's going to give us a timeline of the New Testament.
So, a timeline, 0 to 100, the first century CE. And then up there we have a bar for Jesus. It's believed he was born 1 CE and died in 33. He began his ministry at 30. So it's assumed that his ministry or his baptism, he was about 30 years old when he was baptized. And so that is the timeline of Paul, born shortly after and...
That's more ministry than...
Oh, ministry.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
That's my mistake. Yeah.
Cool, no worries. Ministry. So Paul kind of started to be on the scene shortly after Jesus' death, maybe a year or two after Jesus actually died. He was a Pharisee and worked with the chief priests to root out the heretics of the people who follow Jesus. In the book of Acts, we have the story of our patron saint, Saint Stephen, getting stoned by Saint Paul. And I guess one thing to note also is Paul is also referred to as Saul. It's not a name change. It's just simply the fact he changed his name wherever he was. Saul in Palestine, Paul in Roman areas. He was also believed to be a Roman citizen as well.
How old was he, or do we know?
I think he's probably about the same age as Jesus.
Yeah, I think he's about 60 when he dies.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I guess roughly about the same age and had about 30 years of ministry.
Yeah.
And so some of our writings, in the oldest writings in the Christian Testament are Paul's. So like the first one being the letter to the Thessalonians, yeah, the first one. Second one is debatable if it's him, right? Yeah.
And there's some epistles where Paul says, look, I'm writing this with my own hand, see how large the letters are. So we get the sense that his vision is failing in old age, and so he has to write, he doesn't have reading glasses, so he has to write really big letters, and so, Colossians maybe? It's at the end of Colossians, I can't remember.
Rome. He writes that in Rome. It's
Okay,
like,
all right, so it's
yeah.
it is Romans, yeah. So.
Colossians, I believe, is one of the questionable
Yeah.
ones, yeah. So there's the pastoral epistles, Timothy, Titus, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, which are attributed to Paul, but definitely not. And then there's a handful of others that are questionable Paul. But so the for sure ones are 1st and 2nd Corinthians, 1st Thessalonians, Romans, Galatians, 2nd Corinthians possibly, but that one's just a very weird letter. It's maybe like 3 or 4 letters spliced together. So right there is Nero's reign of terror. So at the tail end of Paul's ministry. And so this is a very important date, 66 CE. That is...
Space one more time, because sorry. Yeah. Sorry for the animation error.
No worries. So Mark is written about 60-ish. That's when the first reference we have of it kind of being on the scene. And then shortly after is the destruction of the temple, and that's kind of a crucial moment for Christianity and Judaism as a whole. Yeah. I mean, I know like Mark was kind of written in such a way to disprove other people claiming to be the Messiah. Like the big thing is the secret Messiah in Mark. Jesus habitually refers or says like, don't tell anyone. You got it right, but don't tell anyone. Don't share, don't share. Because there's so many, it was kind of like a reference to like so many people claiming to be the Messiah. And he's like, no, the real Messiah never said that. Jesus is the real guy. And here's why. Yeah.
The only thing I would add to that is, so we remember from school that Nero fiddled while Rome burned. After he would put down the violin, he needed someone to blame for the fires, and so he blamed the followers of Christus, which is a Latinization, they just flip the I for an E, the followers of Christ. So Nero is blaming the fires on Christians, and it's in this kind of early Roman persecution in Rome that we think Mark was with. So Mark is definitely written to a community that has experienced and lived through some intense trauma and probably a number of martyrs.
Mm-hmm.
Paul and Peter among them.
So the next one, written after the destruction of the temple, was Matthew. And that kind of becomes, again, a major point, is the destruction of the temple. Again, for both Christianity and Judaism, Judaism's whole form of worship changed after that. Their worship was all centered in the temple. So for both Christians and Jews at the time, it was this big, what's now the source of our faith? Jews went to the law, Christians were like, no, Jesus is kind of the new temple. He's the new person for that. So that's when was kind of the battle until about, 150 CE, 200, I think is when there was a true delineation between Christian and Jews. And same time or shortly after was the Gospel of Luke. Took a very different stance towards it. Matthew focused much more on the Jewish community and to Jews in particular to try to get them to join. And Luke turns it towards Gentiles. And that's why like the whole second half of the Gospel of Luke, the book of Acts, is, all the ministry going out to Asia Minor, Greece, and stuff like that.
So this, I think the second thing that, if you hit the space bar one more time. The second thing that is important, is kind of a marker of identity, is around the year 80 to 90, we have this movement by Jewish leaders in synagogues across Palestine to remove Christians from the temple or from the synagogues. And we think that happened before the Gospel of John was written, probably in the last decade of the first century, so somewhere 90 to 105, somewhere in there. I generally date it to about 90, 95, somewhere in there. But there's an animosity between Christians and Jews that is highlighted in the Gospel of John. There's a tension in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That tension is boiled over in John's Gospel. The place to look for that is John 9, which is the story of the boy born blind. So Jesus performs a miracle, but actually most of the chapter isn't the miracle, it's how do we figure out what this miracle means? And the parents of the boy born blind they're shown to be scared of the temple leadership. If they admit that Jesus guy is the one who caused this miracle, they're going to get kicked out of the temple. So they say, hey, he's old enough. He can answer for himself. And so when Christians are removed from the temple, that animosity, I think, is evident in John's gospel in a way that it isn't in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I think this also just kind of gets to the point we're driving to in this class, which is the context will drive what the meaning and the message of the gospel is. So just like Brian said, Matthew is for a mixed community. He wants both Jews and Gentiles to come together and worship Jesus. There's tons of parables about mixed communities. How do we get these people together? Luke is very much Gentile focused. So the communities matter in how these gospels were written.
So the points for Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, is that the end of their ministry, or?
The great question, thanks. So it's likely when they were written.
When they were written, okay.
So Mark was probably written after the Nero's fire and the persecution that followed, but it very likely happened before the temple was destroyed. Matthew and Luke, we just kind of place some guardrails. It's after the temple is destroyed in 70, but before Christians are removed from the temple in the year 80-ish, 85. Remember, both Christianity and Judaism isn't uniform, so there's always kind of a range. Then John was written. So those point to kind of the likely when the Gospels were written more than anything. Yeah, not when they died, when they wrote their Gospel.
Yes, just to confirm, John the Evangelist is no relative of John the Baptist, correct?
No, great question. Yeah,
John the Baptist was beheaded.
yeah. So John dies probably in year 30 or 32, somewhere in there.
Why does Paul get a blue bar and not an arrow?
That's kind of just when he was. We could point to all the different epistles, but I just put the bar there to show
Okay.
that's when he's active in
Yeah.
ministry.
Got it.
So yeah.
So this is the region that we're talking of.
All right, I hit the space bar a few more times.
Oh, okay.
And then one more. They get John in there. Boom.
Yep. So these are the general locations where we believe the Gospels were written. Mark is Rome. Luke is somewhere in Greece.
That's what I think.
Okay. John is somewhere in Asia Minor, and Matthew is right around Antioch.
Antioch.
Yeah.
And John is probably Ephesus, somewhere in modern day Turkey.
And he never got to Maxwell's house.
Nope.
Yeah,
Nope.
So if the Gospels were developed over these 40 years, how can we explain why they're different? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean,
It's like eyewitnesses,
Yeah.
Lawyers have a field day with eyewitnesses.
Yeah.
Memories vary.
yeah, some of them were written 30 or 40 years after Jesus' death.
Yeah.
Most are 40 years after, yeah.
Yeah, and so I can't remember what I was doing 40 years ago.
So were they aware of each, for instance, has John read Mark's gospel.
You're like 6 slides ahead of
Yep.
us. Yeah, so, but I do want to highlight Juan's point. So when it comes to different eyewitnesses, so your homework for next week is to read Mark's gospel. And there's a detail that really, really matters. By Monday, I'll have a study guide for you. So Mark says not only did Jesus falls, he's beat up, the weight of the cross is heavy, and so the Romans compel Simon of Cyrene to carry the cross. Mark goes one step further. He says, hey, this is Rufus, and I forget the other brother's name. This is his father. And so in Mark's community, Simon of Cyrene, his sons were part of Mark's community. And if you wanted to hear from the guy who carried Jesus' cross, what Jesus looked like, how the crucifixion happened, like go talk to them. His dad carried the cross. And that's obviously a detail that Matthew, Luke, and John wouldn't say because they're not part of that community. But when it comes to eyewitnesses, that's a really fantastic clue as to why the stories are different. There were people who were credible eyewitnesses, and certainly Simon of Cyrene is set up to be one of those credible witnesses. But in Mark, we call out, hey, the son of that guy, the 2 sons of that passerby, you can go talk to, and they'll tell you all this happened. So it becomes a confirmation. Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So, I told you that I was listening to, I can't think the actor's name, was reading, he read the whole Bible, so I'm listening to it in the car. So I started with Mark, and then I'm in John right now, so I started with Mark instead of Matthew. But it seems the further I get away into John, it's very mythological in tone. And and the word, like you said, that Jews is really, he just says the word Jewish all the time. I don't even remember hearing Mark even, Jews referred to as so often as the word Jewish and the Jews, and I just read the blind boy part. But it seems like if you had a belief and how you would want to prove, then you would go back also to, and I know I've read other things too, back to the Old Testament, and then cite things that prove that Jesus is the Messiah. So to me, John seems like almost reading a Greek myth, or it seems very logical. Not that it's not, I'm not debating or talking the truth of it, just in tone, it seems very.
Yeah, I think you're onto something, but the one thing I will, when we get to John, there's an argument that John has his history better than Matthew, Mark, and Luke, at least with the dating of the event, even though he's the last to write. So yeah, it'd be really easy to look at that timeline and think like, oh, John probably is nowhere near close to being right about anything. But I hope by the last week of the class, I'm going to make an argument that John may be the most historically accurate in terms of timing compared to the other Gospels.
Sorry, but I'm never wrong in my assumptions.
Good. Let me go to the store and buy a lotto ticket with you, Lori.
So there's this theory in biblical, I guess, literary criticism called source criticism, and it's kind of discussing the sources that the Gospels used to develop their own, their own story. And so, do you have the diagram on the next slide?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's coming up shortly.
So yeah, it's not likely that any of them were actually there. Other than, does John claim himself to be the beloved or someone else to be the beloved disciple?
Someone else.
Okay.
He was told this so that you might believe.
Okay.
And Luke says absolutely, I was not an eyewitness. I'm organizing the reports for you. So.
Oh, sorry. So yeah, they as Matthew said, like, Luke was there just to organize them. Oops. So, yes, because they all lived in different regions and were written in different areas, it's believed different eyewitnesses to the same event adds to, why there could be some discrepancy in the sources, or in why the Gospels differ. Some stuff seems to be correct, or I guess
Corroborated.
thank you. Cool. But then maybe some people were at different parts, some people just remembered it differently 40 to 60 years after the fact. So, and there is a differentiation between, in the Gospels, between synoptic and John. Synoptic being that they're very related to each other. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke have very similar stories, and part of that is some of their sources. But so so Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus only showed up in Jerusalem in the last week of his life. John, Jesus comes 3 different times.
Oh, that should be the third time, that's a typo.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, Palm Sunday is the 3rd time that he arrives into Jerusalem as his final time. John's gospel also differs in when the crucifixion itself happens. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have Jesus doing a Passover as what we now do as the Eucharist, as a Passover meal with his disciples. In John, Jesus is the Passover sacrificial lamb, so he is crucified on Passover, and the meal is the night before. So again, different eyewitnesses, different things like that.
So this, you want me to take over?
Sure.
So this gets to Lori's point. So which gospel writers, what do they have on their desks? And did they have copies of each other's works? The answer is, I think, yes. Because if you look at Matthew, you can find 98% of Mark is there. So kind of unequivocally. 60%, and then the other way to do this pie chart is 60% of Matthew is taken from the Gospel of Mark. Similarly, 88% of the Gospel of Mark is in Luke's Gospel, and a little under half, 47% of Luke's Gospel, we could say, hey, this came from Mark.
That was before Google.
That was before Google. So it seems really clear that Matthew and Luke had a copy of Mark sitting on their desk, which is why we think, one of the reasons why we think Mark was written first is that there was time to get this gospel spread around kind of the burgeoning Christian movement. So if we have a pile of papers, sorry, Pat, you got a question?
I was just gonna say, so they all took from each other?
They didn't take from each other, but Matthew and Luke certainly took from Mark. Mark put his pen down, and so he couldn't take it. He was the first to turn in his homework assignment. So that he didn't take anything from Matthew or Luke, but the opposite is absolutely true. So Mark gets taken in Matthew and Mark, or Matthew and Luke take Mark, put it in their gospel. But there's also a lot of times when we look at Matthew and Luke where they agree with each other without Mark. And what's strange about this is every time these minor agreements happen, so Matthew and Luke agree without Mark, Jesus is speaking. It's a quote. So one great example is the sermon on either the plain or the mount, depending on if you're Luke or Matthew. Jesus is talking. There's the Beatitudes. the parables. Jesus tends to be speaking when they agree without Mark. And so it seems that there's this, not a gospel, not a narrative, but a collection of things that Jesus said and taught and teached. I've just invented that word, teached. We can't find a copy of this. We've never found a copy of this sayings. But German theologians writing in the 19th century started calling this source collection of sayings Quelle, which is German for source, and they shortened it to Q. I'm not going to outline for being too young to know who this is, but this is Q from the Bond series, all the way through Pierce Brosnan. So from 63 to 2003, this was my Q, who I met the day before he died, tragically, at a book signing tour. So we've got Mark and we've got Q. And from that, we can write most of Matthew and Luke. But there's also things that are only found in Matthew, stories like the Nativity, where we've got the Magi, where we've got, what's another one that's only in Matthew?
You're on your own, honey.
Oh, yeah, sorry, the earthquakes. There's a few other things. So there are things that are just special to Matthew's gospel. And so we call that group of resources Special Matthew. Luke has his own special quotes and stories that no one else has. So the story of the angels and the shepherds at the Nativity, the parable of the prodigal son, there's a lot of parables that only appear in Luke's gospel.
Good Samaritan.
The Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, there's a few others. And then when we get to the resurrection narrative, the walk to Cana, the post-resurrection teaching experiences, those only happen in Luke's gospel. Now, if you read Mark, start to finish, you wouldn't be wrong in thinking that it all happened in a couple of months. What we're going to look at kind of as kind of summary next week is Mark's favorite preposition is "and then," et hoi in Greek. And then, and then, and then. Listening to Mark tell his story is like listening to your 4-year-old grandchild in your life tell you the story of Jesus. And then Jesus went, and then Jesus went, and then Jesus went. It could be temporally really compact. But when Ryan said that we think that Jesus was in ministry for 3 years, it has nothing to do with Mark, it has everything to do with John. So in John's gospel, Jesus makes 3 trips to Jerusalem for the Passover every year because Jesus is, shock to all of us I know, a devout Jewish man. So he goes to Jerusalem 3 different times in John's gospel, and that's how we're able to say Jesus' ministry lasted 3 years, is because it happens over 3 trips to the Passover in Jerusalem. And so John is just kind of all by himself. If you look at the geography of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it starts in Galilee, and it moves in one direction, and we get to Jerusalem for the very first time on Palm Sunday. In John, we yo-yo between Galilee and Jerusalem. And things happen in John's gospel in Jerusalem that we have in no other gospel. The story of the woman at the well, the cleansing of the temple in chapter 2 happens in John. It happens super early in John's gospel. It's not a Holy Week event. John is kind of off by himself. So Matthew and Luke, they had Mark, they had Q, they had their own special eyewitnesses, and then there's John, off on his own. And you are now smarter than half of all seminary graduates. If you can understand that, you guys are halfway to the priesthood, if you would like to be. So, any questions there? I think that, and let me kind of go back to the graphic. Yeah, Pat, you've got a question?
What time is the service on Good Friday?
Noon and 7 p.m. And so just a warning, so the thing that I started doing, because I didn't like that tension, is what we're going to do is we're not going to hear from John's Gospel on Good Friday. We're in year C, which is the Gospel of Luke. So we're going to hear on Palm Sunday the story of the entry into Jerusalem from Luke. And then when we get to Maundy, Thursday, we're going to hear the Last Supper and in the garden in Luke's Gospel. Then on Good Friday, we're going to hear the Passion in Luke's Gospel. And then on Easter Sunday, we're going to hear Luke's Gospel. So we're going to go straight through one Gospel each year. And that's how I am heretical and dragging you all unwillingly and against your...
Leading us astray.
Yeah, not leading you astray, just diverting from the prayer book is all I'm doing. So let the bishop know that this is, if all I'm doing is changing what gospel I read on Good Friday, I'm probably not too heretical. So any questions from online? Nope, okay.
Any questions in here?
Yeah. So, like Ryan said, when we have a whole bunch of different eyewitnesses, it's possible that Jesus cursed more than one fig tree. And one person remembered it like, oh, that fig tree died that moment. Or I think that fig tree died like a week later when Jesus was walking back through that area. Or maybe it took a day or two, right? Or maybe Jesus just really had a thing in for fig trees and didn't like them, and he cursed many fig trees. Some of them died immediately, some of them withered slowly. What we need to remember is that excuse evaporates when we get to Good Friday, because we can't say that Jesus died 4 different times and said different things. Now, you could argue that maybe not everybody heard everything, right? So some churches have the tradition of what we call the 7 words, which is all 7 sayings of Jesus on the cross. And maybe Matthew and Mark only heard the first bit. My God, why have you forsaken me? They didn't hear the it is finished. They didn't hear, surely you will be with me today in paradise. We could make that allowance, but really it probably comes down to what fits the drama and the theology of the evangelist. That, I think, is the easier explanation as to why the stories differ. It doesn't mean they're not historical, but theology, I think, shapes the story more than anything. That's my 2 cents. You want to tackle what they all have in common?
So like all of them have some sort of meal the Thursday before his arrest. Judas is the one who betrays Jesus. They all have a trial in front of the Sanhedrin, or the Jewish council. And then he's handed over to Pilate on Friday morning. And Peter will deny Jesus 3 times in every gospel. He is sentenced to death by Pilate and is crucified next to 2 bandits. The inscription placed above his cross, the casting of lots, and how quickly Jesus dies on the cross. And that Joseph of Arimathea is the one who recovers the body and places it in the tomb, newly hewn tomb. So those are all the things that every gospel corroborates. Why can I not say that? Corroborates.
Has in common.
Yes, common elements.
We don't always have to go for the $2 word.
Yeah, but with seminaries.
I know. Well,
Yeah, fair.
That's true.
You can now.
I did score all 400 on my SAT verbal, so.
So yeah, everyone gets the people right, at least in the gospel or in the gospel stories. They differ actually on apostles, right?
Yes.
Right.
But those listed.
Yeah, these listed here, all the same in every story, in all four gospels. Things that are different. Okay. So just Jesus fall. Is that one only in Luke?
No, Jesus never falls in John's gospel.
Oh, okay. See, I don't
Could
even
that
know.
be just an error of omission, or?
So I think this is, when we talk about theology, so does Jesus fall? Does anyone help carry the cross? And is the Son visible at Jesus' death? John does not see the cross as shameful or agonizing. Jesus is in control, and he sacrifices himself willingly. So he doesn't fall because he is strengthened to do this. No one helps carry the cross because Jesus says time and time again, this is my cross to bear. Ahead of this, John is the only gospel where Jesus doesn't pray to have this cup pass over him. The whole point of Jesus is to be crucified. And so the sun is shining because this is the ultimate gospel pun. The sun does not fail. S-U-N-S-O-N. The Son is successful in John's gospel. The other thing that may be happening, and we'll talk about in week 5, is as we go through the timeline through the first century, there's a group of Christians called Gnostics. Gnostics comes from the Greek word for knowledge, which is gnosis, and they think that Jesus, so the first thing to know about Gnostics is they're heretical. And the reason they're heretical is they didn't think that Jesus ever had a body. They thought that Jesus was a ghost, a spirit, who helped his followers escape the material world and get back into the spiritual world. And so one of the things the Gnostics argued was the Romans didn't crucify Jesus, because you can't nail a ghost to a tree. So their argument is the Romans didn't really care who they crucified. And so the Romans said, hey, you, Joseph of Arimathea, carry this cross. And by the time they got up to the cross, it's like, oh, well, this guy's carrying the cross. This is the guy we crucified. And so that they actually crucified Simon of Cyrene rather than Jesus. And so it might also be, this is where theology might be informing John's version of events, is make no mistake, Jesus had a body, he was crucified, and the way we help reinforce that is we do not mention any Jesus falling or needing any help in carrying the cross. So it may be an omission, Russ, but it's an absolutely intentional, it could be an absolutely intentional omission to make sure that the Gnostics just shut up.
Okay.
Because we're tired of hearing their nonsense that Jesus didn't have a body.
That was the Arians? Different than
Yeah.
the German ones, but
Yeah.
there's a heresy called Arianism, and they were the ones who had that belief.
For that, you have to wait for Trinity Sunday to hear.
You didn't preach unless you
Where was
commit a
that
heresy.
timeline?
The Pharisees, actually, the Gnostics start showing up probably around like 70, 75. So it's probably after Matthew and Luke have written their Gospels. But they stay really, they kind of approach their zenith at the end, like around 110 to 120. So when we start looking at what we call the early church fathers, they're spending more and more time defeating this heresy and kind of putting down Gnosticism. Gnosticism got a huge revival in interest with the publishing of the Da Vinci Code, right? There's a number of things that the Da Vinci Code was provocative and it was fun to entertain, but his religious editor was not worth anything. The book talks about how, so if we go back to that timeline, that nobody said that Jesus was the divine Son of God until the Council of Nicaea in 312. Well, that forgets what Paul said. They're 30 and 40, right? Hey, this Jesus of Nazareth is the Son of God, right? So, people love Gnostics because there's a gospel called the Gospel of Thomas, and people love to point to the Gospel of Thomas as being radically inclusive of gender because it elevates Mary Magdalene. It kind of gives us a sense that they might have been romantically involved. I won't say one way or the other. It leaves the question open. There are several scenes in which Jesus gives absolute authority to Mary Magdalene as a future leader of the church. And so people say, oh my gosh, let's run to that and let's use the Gospel of Thomas to highlight and elevate the voices of women in the early Christian period. They never read the last chapter of that book because Jesus said, after saying all these great things about Mary Magdalene, he says that for Mary Magdalene to enter the kingdom of heaven, she must first become a spiritual man. And then the wind is blown out of the balloon. We've kind of lost our opportunity to celebrate and highlight the role of women in the early church. If we want to find that, we actually don't have to go outside the Bible. We can go right to the letters of Paul. Paul, again and again, uses typically feminine and names women. The tense or the Greek language helps us out there. It's pretty clear these are women who are leading the churches in Corinth, in Galatia, right? So there are plenty of places to find the role of women elevated in the New Testament era without going to heretical sources. So that was a little bit too long of a diversion, but I hope I made my point. Yeah.
Just two quick questions. Some statues of Jesus, you see the abbreviation INRI.
Yes.
What's that?
Dear me, sir.
I don't remember.
Okay, so it's using the Greek letters for Jesus Christ, King of the Jews. It's kind of the inscription that Pilate writes over.
So it's Greek.
It's the first letters of Jesus of
Isu.
Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. So Yeshua, Nazarite, Regnum, Israel. Is the rough translation.
Second question.
Yeah.
Could different geography, different language, different culture account for some of the differences in the different Passion narratives?
They were all written in Greek
Oh.
Yeah.
because that was, at the time, the lingua franca. It wasn't Latin because of Alexander the Great's whole expansion all the way to the Indus River Valley. Greek was by far the uniform language, and Rome just used that instead. So outside of the Italian peninsula, Greek was what the language everyone spoke in common, yeah.
But it also, what the Gospels translate for the audience is a clue of geography. So so in Mark, we hear Jesus, Mark quotes Jesus speaking Aramaic. So in Mark and Jesus said, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? So Mark's audience didn't speak Aramaic and he has to translate it for them. The other reason why we think, well, we'll get into this in week 4, Luke uses a lot of Latinized, and Mark does too, a lot of Latinized translations of Hebrew and Greek names, and so they're really influenced by the Latin language, which gives us a clue of where they were writing. So these are the clues that give us the attributes of where they were writing. If we have to translate Aramaic, we know that he was reading his gospel to an audience who didn't speak Aramaic. Yeah. So.
How long did it take for Jesus to die on the cross?
3 less than 6 hours. So Jesus is crucified at 9 a.m. and dies by 3. And that is a surprise to the people who did it. So in John's gospel, John and Luke, we've got people who say, like, listen, Passover is coming. We need these bodies off the cross before the holy day of Passover. Sunset is coming. Break their legs. Let's get this over with. Because death by crucifixion is suffocation. You don't have the energy to pull up your chest and breathe. And so the nice thing to do was to break your legs so you couldn't push up and kind of bring your chest up and breathe. So, and so I think it's in John's gospel, they're kind of surprised by how quickly Jesus expires. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I think, so again, about 25 years ago, if we saw the Passion of the Christ, the Mel Gibson film, yeah. That is a no-hold-barred look that Jesus was repeatedly, his body was subject to ongoing and repeated trauma. He was just exhausted before he even started to be crucified, and that's why he died. Theologically, John might argue that Jesus had perfect control over everything, even his own ability to die. The answer, I think, is somewhere in between. But it is, what I want to highlight is, for the people in the story, it was surprisingly quick. There's a lot of evidence from that era where people might take 2 and even 3 days to die. That's why it was a punishment. It was not a, I hate to go more pop culture. If you remember the movie The Green Mile, electric chair, where water is not administered, right? Like that comes close to the kind of torturous way to die. So yeah, Pat.
He was also stabbed.
So in John he's stabbed, but that's just to prove he's dead. So that they go to break. So the centurions go to break the legs of all 3. They think Jesus is dead, but they don't know, and so what they do is they stab him in the side, and when he doesn't react to that, and they see the water and the wine kind of, or the blood pour out of him, that's proof that he is dead, is that when you stab him in the side, yeah, and that protects and lives into the prophecy of Psalm 22 that no bone shall be broken. Yeah. I had a question in the here.
Have more. Going to add about at 7:10. I can't have anything to eat anymore. I get comfy tonight.
Yeah, so the only difference is so crucified at 9 in the morning, at noon in the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that's when the sun fails. What we'll talk about there is how does the sun fail? Everyone's first guess is eclipse. But it can't be an eclipse. I'm going to just come over to the video. Because what do you... Yeah, it just can't be an eclipse because what do you need for it to be Passover? You need a full moon. And if you have a full moon on this side of the earth, you can't have a new moon eclipsing the sun on the other side of the earth. So it can't be an eclipse, so it has to be something else. So, yeah.
the scripture something, instead of crucified, died, and was buried, he was tortured, crucified, and was buried, or something like that.
I don't know, but it certainly gets the point home.
Yeah, but there is something that said that before he was crucified, he was tortured.
Is that the old creed?
Maybe before it was like the
79?
original Nicene, maybe? We'll look it up, I don't know, yeah.
Might be,
Yeah. Okay, so, sorry, I skipped a slide. So we're going to look at the differences in these unique eyewitness accounts. And what we're going to do, I think, first and foremost is show you who the audience of this evangelist was, because I think that's where we can attribute much of the difference. What had they experienced as Christians? This is absolutely, it feeds into the fear of the Markan community. They've been beat up and persecuted as Christians. It comes into the experience of being separated and made to feel other in the Jewish community in John's gospel. How did their recent experience color their understanding of Jesus? Were they Jewish? Were they Gentile? Was it a mixed community? All of that will have a huge role in kind of what the cross means. And so for next week, what we're going to do is we're going to look only at Mark's gospel. And what will be hard about that is our default nature is we want to compare it to something, and we have nothing to compare it to yet. So we're just going to look at Mark's gospel and what they think the cross might have meant. So there will be a study guide that'll be emailed out on Monday that'll help you kind of read through Mark's gospel. If you want to read it right now, just shoot chapters 14 and 15. It's a nice short read. That's the great thing about Mark always. But when you read Mark, think about the quiz, because all of us have a hybrid kind of conglomerated gospel in our heads, right? We think that there's a gospel where the angels and the shepherds appeared, and there's the Sermon on the Mount, and I'm trying to think of a story that happens only in Mark. And I don't think anybody really goes to this, but there's the father who has a demoniac son, and there's Jesus fishing with his buddies after his resurrection, right? That's all four gospels. There's no gospel that has all those stories in them. So compare it to what Good Friday is in your head, is I think the best thing we can do to start.
what makes a gospel a gospel? Why is it called the gospel instead of some other reading?
A biography. You want to take it?
Because it's sharing the good news of Jesus.
Well, it's all of it.
Fair, but like specifically, like why the epistles are not referred to that, it's literally about Jesus' stories and his life and ministry. That's what makes it the gospel.
Okay.
And then the early church got together, and so there's a lot more. So there's the four gospels that we call canon. There's the Gospel of Thomas. There's the Gospel of Mary.
The infancy gospel of Thomas.
Yep.
Peter. The proto-gospel of James. And that one's interesting because it was going to be considered at one point canon. That's where like some Catholic theology is taken from, like the perpetual virginity of Mary. The reason why it didn't get in was because Jesus shows up in the last chapter. It's all about Mary and the story of her pregnancy and stuff like that, and them proving that she was still a virgin. So yeah, like little things like that, and they kind of weeded it out, being like, it's not enough about Jesus, we're not going to have it in.
All right, I see Amy Worth telling me to get the camera up to chest level because she's tired of looking up my nose. There we go. Oops, get Ryan in there. So the last thing, just as a housekeeping item is, I've kind of forgot that in years past, we sometimes organize the Lenten class as a kind of a soup and supper, kind of a shared meal and then some learning. And so I guess the question now is would we, for those of you who would like to meet in person, would we like to kind of gather and do a potluck for the remaining 4 weeks? Or did we want to keep it just kind of a class and we show up after dinner?
Or
Or I can just bring dessert.
Or
Dessert.
Dr. Childs could just bring a berry pie from Nations, so.
Next week I will bring
What about
mine.
week 5? Could we do it on week 5?
Yeah, you want to do that? Well, okay, so we'll share that in the email. So on week 5, we'll gather at 6 o'clock, and we'll share a meal beforehand, and then before week 5, we'll just lean on Ken to bully him into bringing some pie for us. Sounds good. So to all my friends on Zoom, thank you so much for joining. If you join us in person, week 5 will be a potluck. But we thank you for joining us tonight. And any questions before we close?
No.
Heaven or hell?
No, thanks.
Ooh, keep asking me that question, because that is a thread we're gonna trace for the next 5 weeks. All the Gospels take increasing pains to make sure Pilate is not a bad guy. But keep asking that question, because it's really important.
Okay.
Yeah.
You weren't.
Yeah. So the question is Pilate in heaven? Yeah. So.
Or hell.
Or hell. So, all right. Friends online, thank you for joining. And
Oh my God.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
thanks, Jesus. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.